Hey, it's Ryan, and today I have for you my review of the PowerPole Move ZR trolling motor. The reason I'm doing this review is because each year I put a new trolling motor on my boat. This spring was no different. At that point, there were a lot of different options on the market, which there didn't used to be a few years ago, but PowerPole then came out with their version with the ZR and the PV trolling motors. So I was very interested in them, but at that time they were so new that there just wasn't much for reviews. I decided to wait on the trolling motor and wait until I could get a little bit of feedback on them, but by this summer I simply just couldn't find very much on it still. So what I ended up doing was in early August I put in an order at Hanay's Marine in the Twin Cities, and initially I was told that it was going to be around a 12-week wait, but I was also told not to be surprised if it showed up much sooner. After putting in the order, the trolling motor showed up a week later. I put it on my boat immediately, and I've been using it now for a little over a month. To give you a little background on my situation and my experience with trolling motors, I operate a guide service on Mille and Big Stone Lakes during the summer. I put in somewhere in the neighborhood of about 200 days a year on open water, most of which are guiding. I also do some fun fishing and a few tournaments as well. I have a 21-foot multi-species boat. It's a big boat. I need a powerful trolling motor to pull it around, so I always opt for the 60-inch shaft trolling motors and the 36-volt systems. I've had cable steers and the electric steers and the newer kind of hybrid scissor mount trolling motors, which have the anchor modes on them. In the past few years, I've had Terrovas, Ulterras, Ultrexes, as well as a Ghost. All of those trolling motors have served their purpose as well, and I have no major complaints. So to give you a little overview of what I'm going to cover, I'm going to go over the installation, I'm going to go over the foot pedal, the remote, as well as the overall performance. When I first pulled this motor out of the box, there were a few things I noticed. One is how small it is. Number two is how rigid the mount is. And number three is how light it is. It's considerably lighter than other comparable trolling motors I've had in the past. The mount is absolutely rigid on this thing. When you go to mount it on your boat, you're going to notice that it doesn't have the little kickstand on it, the support arm. And at first that was a little bit concerning. I thought, why wouldn't they just include that? But upon mounting it on the boat, I realized that it's a rock solid mount on it. It probably just isn't necessary. As far as the weight on it, I threw it on the bathroom scale to see how much it weighed. They advertise it as weighing 55 pounds, put all the accessories on it with it, and found it to be right at 55 pounds. Compared to other trolling motors, comparable trolling motors that I've had in the past, I found that it was anywhere from 17 to about 25 pounds lighter. When mounting it on the boat, they have an option for a mounting plate, so you can use the existing holes from other trolling motors. I opted to mount it directly to the boat. I did have to drill new holes. They recommend you use all 6 bolts, and upon using the trolling motor, I think I know why. There's a ton of power, a ton of torque behind this trolling motor. So they want you to use all 6 bolts, and they want you to spread them apart as far as you can. It comes with a template. The template makes things a little bit easier. Now, there's a couple other accessories with this trolling motor. They call them wireless, so you have the stomp buttons for the anchor mode and the navigation mode. You also have the foot pedal, which you can screw down if you prefer to. I just put mine right on the carpet. It comes with a display screen that's going to tell you what power or speed that you're on, as well as what mode you're using, navigation or anchor, as well as a couple other functions. And lastly is the remote cradle. The rechargeable remote has a charging cradle. So those are the other things that you're going to have to mount. As far as the remote cradle, what I did is I just put mine up under the dash. I didn't mount it. I just wired it in and just put it up in storage under the dash. That's worked well for me. I didn't have to put any extra holes in the boat. For the foot pedal, like I said, I didn't screw it down to the floor. I just threw it right up on the carpet. It hasn't moved. It hasn't been an issue. I can move it around as I need to. So I didn't mount that to anything either. The display screen, I mounted it to the bow. I mounted it in a position where when I'm standing up on the bow using the foot pedal, I can see it over my electronics. When I'm sitting down in the driver's seat, I can look underneath my electronics and see it. Now the cradle, the display screen, and the pedal, they say they're wireless, which they kind of are, but they're not. You still have to connect those to power. But the neat thing about the power is there's no communication cables on them, so you don't need to connect it to the trolling motor. And you can use whatever power is available, whether it be 12, 24, or 36 volts. So rigging those up is pretty simple. When you do get the motor mounted onto the boat, you're going to notice that it's extremely small. It's extremely low profile. It fits under your boat cover very well. So if you had an older boat that had a cable steer on it and then you went to some of the newer style trolling motors, sometimes they wouldn't fit under the cover. This new one will, at least it did for me. Another thing about mounting it is the head is so small on it that you can mount it in a way where you don't have to worry about any part hanging over the bow. So in the past, there's kind of been a little argument on whether you do the prop in or out, the head in or out when you're mounting it or stowing it or deploying on the boat. With this one, it's so compact that I haven't had that issue. I can always mount the prop in and I never have to worry about the head hitting anything. Stowing it and deploying it's easy enough. I mean, it's comparable to any other trolling motor out there with the scissor mount. There is a fail-safe on the side, so if you are to break the rope or cable on it, that you can just use your fingers, pop that little switch, and stow it or deploy it without the cable. Adjusting this trolling motor up or down is much, much easier than anything I've used in the past. There's a little clamp on it, and all you do is open up the clamp. It lifts very easy with one hand. It doesn't bind like other trolling motors do. It's by far the easiest one I've used. And that's important on the 60-inch shaft models because especially if you have like a forward-facing sonar or a live sonar mounted onto the shaft, a lot of times on other units that you'll use, you'll find that if you put it all the way down in big water, that you have to still lift up that head each time you go to stow it with having those transducers on it. With this one, that's not much of an issue. You still have to lift that head up and down. The scissor mount isn't long enough to accommodate the full 60-inch shaft, but lifting it up and down is much, much easier on this trolling motor than other ones I've used in the past. It's a rock solid mount, like I said earlier, and it's got a titanium shaft on it, so everything feels very rigid. There's very little play in it at all. And that's going to be important later when I start talking about the performance. There's some really key benefits to that. Next is the foot pedal. They call it a real feel foot pedal, and I understand why. It's got like a certain texture to it when you rock it back and forth. There's an app for this trolling motor where you can adjust pretty much anything you can think of on the trolling motor. The speed at which it turns, the rate at which it locks back into a position on anchor mode, the brightness of the lights on it. There's a lot of different functions in that app that you can adjust to accommodate what you like. I found that on the app, I personally didn't need to really adjust much at all. All I did was I upped the brightness on the screen to full power because I don't do a ton of night fishing. And then the other thing is I just upped the reaction time between the head and the foot pedal so they're more in sync. When you get it out of the box, you're going to find that on a hard turn, the head might lag a little bit behind the foot pedal. I just upped that speed and it solved that problem. The functions of the foot pedal are pretty straightforward. It's on, off, left, right, faster, slower. But those functions are very well thought out. So on the real feel foot pedal, you can feel the texture of yourself moving back and forth, and that's nice because you can make very small incremental movements. You're not restricted in your movement at all with it, but you can feel how far and how fast you're going with it. So that's really beneficial, especially if you're using the live sonar. It really allows you to dial things in. Next is the on-off switch. It's got a very light on-off switch, and at first I thought that might be a little bit problematic as far as not being able to control, how well you're turning it on or off, but that hasn't been an issue at all. Something that I actually like about the switch on it is that when you go to press the switch on some trolling motors, you would find that you would hit the switch, but it took so much pressure that you would start turning the trolling motor while trying to hit the on-off switch. And when using live sonar, a lot of times that can be problematic to keep things lined up while also hitting that on-off switch. This one's very light, so you don't run into that issue. Lastly, on the foot pedal is the speed control. The speed control is very light. It'll turn infinitely forward or reverse. The cool thing about the functions on this trolling motor is there's audible signals. You can hear what you're doing. So when you are using the speed switch on it, you can hear how much and how fast you're increasing the speed, and you can also hear another audible to tell whether you're decreasing the speed. It's a very lightweight wheel, so it's very easy to turn with your foot. I never find myself in rough water trying to bend over to adjust it and make fine-tuned movements with it. I can do it very easily with my foot, and you can do it in just single increments. So that little speed wheel on it, that's been perfect. Next is the remote. There's audibles when you hit buttons on the remote. So when you increase the speed or decrease the speed, you can hear it. When you're using functions such as anchor or navigation, you can hear audibles for those as well. The other couple things that are on the remote that are unique to the remote are going to be a reverse button. And the reverse button, what it does is it just turns the prop in reverse. So the trolling motor head isn't going to turn, it's just going to back the boat up. And that's really nice in a couple different instances. The two times where I've been using it is when I'm pulling up to an area and I see something on my screen and I don't want to get any closer. You hit that button and it stops the boat almost immediately. The second thing that it's really nice for is when you get in really heavy mats of weeds and you have a buildup of weeds on the shaft of the trolling motor, you can hit that reverse switch and you can back away from those weeds. It's been very beneficial. The one thing they say about reverse on it is do not use it in an area where you might hit something. Apparently it can cause damage to the motor, so just keep that in mind if you use it. The next thing on the remote is you can pair it up with your power pole. So if you have poles on the boat, you can sync it with them. That way you only have one remote on you. You don't need to keep multiple remotes with you. That functions excellent. It took nothing to pair them together. So that's really handy having all of that on one rechargeable remote. The anchor mode does have the jog feature on the remote. So you can bump it 5 feet one way, 5 feet the next, or you can hit the button a few times to go in 5-foot increments. So you could hit it 3 times to move 15 feet. The remote fits well in your hand. It's ergonomic, it's intuitive. You don't need to look down at it in order to use it. Once you get used to it, you can use it without even looking at it. One last thing I'd like to point out on the remote is what I would like to see on this remote is LED indicators on the remote that mirror the indicators that are on top of the trolling motor. The indicators that are on top of the trolling motor are not very bright. I think they're suited more to night fishermen. At night I've used them in the past and they're not too bright, they're not too dim, they're just right for fishing at night. But if they could put those same LED indicators on the remote, because on windy days sometimes it's hard to hear the audibles whether you're turning something on or off, and depending on where you're at in the boat there may be people or stuff in the way where you can't see the screen. If they could just put those same LED indicators on the remote, that would be ideal. That way you could just look down at the remote and see whether navigation is on, anchor is on, or whether the prop is on. And lastly is the performance of the motor. The performance on this has been excellent. The power is incredible. So on previous 36-volt brush trolling motors I've had, they would push my boat about 2.8 miles an hour. It's a big 21-foot multi-species boat. It's a lot of boat to move around. So 2.8 was about as fast as they would go. On brushless trolling motors that I've had, they would push this boat about 3.5. So that was a considerable bump up in power to those. This trolling motor will push this boat 3.9 miles an hour. I think if I had a little bit of backwind to me, I could probably get it up over 4, but 3.9 on a calm day, comparable circumstances, it's got a lot more power. And the thing about that, for every gain in speed that you're getting out of a trolling motor, you're talking exponentially more power, more torque. So to go from 3.5 on one brushless motor to this one 3.9 just speaks to the fact of how much torque this little trolling motor has. Now, it's not always about the power, it's also about how it's used. And some trolling motors I've found that maybe the mount on them or the combination of the mount and shaft, there's play in the mount, there's a lot of wiggle in the shaft, they're flexible. And what I found is in bigger water that can create a lot of vibration. So there's a few different things going on with this trolling motor that really reduce vibration. And I think they all add together to make it vibrate very, very little, even under some pretty extreme circumstances. So the two times where I run into the most vibration with the trolling motor are when I'm in big water and the prop is cavitating, and the second time is when I'm in heavy vegetation and the blade gets wrapped up with weeds. First, I'll talk about the big water. When I'm out in big waves and I'm using spot lock 3-foot stuff and we're just rocking out on the lake, every once in a while you're going to cavitate a little bit. A lot of trolling motors really struggle on the anchor mode when you're in those conditions. Not only does the anchor mode tend to veer off and overcorrect and have trouble with that, but I think part of that also comes down to the vibration of the motor. It takes the motor longer to recover when it comes out of the water. Apparently with this trolling motor, they talk about it using lower RPMs. You'll see that the lower unit is very small on this trolling motor, the motor itself, but the prop is very, very large on it. And there's something about that, there's something about the lower RPMs that creates a lot less vibration. The other thing about this trolling motor is the mount is very low profile. While it is a 60-inch shaft like the other ones I've had, the combination of the smaller head, the smaller motor, and the lower profile mount really add to more usable shaft length. So you don't find yourself cavitating as much. It doesn't come out of the water nearly as often as other trolling motors. And I think that since it has a titanium shaft on it, there's not very much flex in it. It doesn't want to come out of the water very easily, and when it does, it recovers very quickly. So you just don't deal with the same amount of vibration on this one that you do with other ones. It's very, very minimal. To go along with that is not only is it much quieter in the water since you don't have that vibration, not only does it recover much quicker in the anchor mode, but the other thing is it's very quiet both in and out of the water. The motor underwater is almost silent. You can barely hear it unless you're on the highest of powers. And the motor out of the water to steer it is nearly silent as well. You can hardly hear this motor turn. Now, if you do a hard turn left or right, sure, you can hear a little bit of winding on it, but it's very, very minimal. It is by far the quietest motor I've ever used. The next thing to the vibration is when you're in heavy weeds. And this is another time where you get a few weeds wrapped around the prop and you deal with a massive amount of vibration. There's been other prop nuts over the years that are supposed to combat that a little bit, but there's something to the shape of this prop where it's very, very resilient to weeds, much better than other ones that I've used in the past. It sheds them like nothing that I've used, nothing that I've seen. It's rare for it to get weeds to actually wrap around it. They really have that figured out. So you don't deal with the vibration of weeds wrapping on the prop. If you do get weeds to wrap around the prop, you don't notice it nearly as much as you do with other trolling motors. The vibration is very minimal, and that just makes things a lot quieter, especially when you're in those shallow, weedy areas. Another thing about fishing in heavy vegetation is a lot of trolling motors can get through the slop. They can just hammer their way through there. If you turn the power all the way up, you can get through quite a bit. This one will do that, no problem. It gets through the thickest, gnarliest, nastiest stuff without issue. I mean, it does it better than the other ones at wide open. But this is where it really shines. I can dial that power way down. Like I can go to 40% power, even 30% power, and I still get through those weeds. There's something about the prop on this thing and the way the motor is shaped where it just doesn't wrap up very easily with weeds. I've used it in a lot of milfoil, curly leaf pondweed, coontail, sago. A lot of these weeds will really wrap up a prop, and this one, it somehow gets through them even at low power. So you don't have to hammer on that on-off switch and go wide open, stop, wide open, stop. You can dial it way back and you can creep through those weeds and it just doesn't get gummed up like other ones do. And lastly, it was one of the most important functions for me. It's something that I use all the time in guiding, and that's the anchor mode. Now I use that fun fishing, use it in tournaments, everybody uses the anchor mode. But for guiding, I lean heavily on the anchor mode because I've got to be tying lines, netting fish, helping people out with certain things. So I lean heavily on that anchor button. I've joked in the past that I could be extorted for that anchor button. I use it so much. And all the trolling motor companies claim about how great their anchor mode is. You know, you hear stuff about, oh, this anchor will keep you in a 5 feet circle. And I just haven't found that to be the truth with any of them. They all have some real shortfalls. This trolling motor's anchor mode is spot on. I mean, it is by far the best I've used. I don't know how they could make it any better. You hit the anchor mode, it stops you in that spot, and it holds you there. It doesn't veer off course. When it comes out of the water in big waves, and once it comes back in, it vibrates minimally and it recovers quickly and gets you right back into position. It just does it better than anything else. And the real test for this is not necessarily in windy days or big water conditions. The real test for the anchor mode is when it gets flat calm. That's when I generally have the biggest issues with trolling motors. When it gets dead calm, you find that the trolling motor may hold you in spot for a while, and then it almost loses its position, loses its mind. I don't know what you want to call it, but all of a sudden it'll overcorrect and deviate and swing back and forth, and then finally kind of correct itself and come back. This one does none of that. You hit the button, it stops you there, and you don't move. And it holds you in a very small area. Other trolling motors that I've had in the past, their anchor mode is pretty decent, but you may hit the button and then it'll back off the spot 20 feet, and then it comes back and corrects itself, and then it holds you there. This one doesn't do that. When you hit that anchor button, it stops you there and it holds you there regardless of the conditions, no matter how windy, how wavy, or how flat calm it is. It is by far the best I've ever used. I couldn't ask for anything more from it. Now, battery consumption is a little bit difficult for me to quantify, but what I can say is in very windy conditions, when using spot lock in areas for a certain amount of time, on previous trolling motors that I've had, brush trolling motors, I've noticed that the power consumption is around 80%, say in a 30-mile-an-hour wind, 2-foot chop. You'll see that trolling motor ride right around the 80% mark. This trolling motor, under those same similar conditions, you see it running around 40 to 50%. So it obviously is consuming a lot less power. I've killed a lot of batteries in the past with brush trolling motors, and this one, I've been using it for over a month. It's September in Minnesota. We've had some extremely windy days out here. I haven't killed the batteries once, not even on double trip days. So the battery consumption is much better. I can't give you an exact number on that, but it is a lot better than brush trolling motors. The last thing is longevity. You know, how long is the trolling motor last? I really don't know. I haven't had a single problem with this trolling motor. Time will tell, but so far so good. I haven't had a single problem with it yet. The only little hiccup that I found with this trolling motor was that it does seem to create a little bit of interference with one particular transducer on my boat. So I've got Lowrance units in my boat. I have the 3-in-1, I have the active target, but I also have an aftermarket Airmar TM150 transducer. And that transducer has picked up interference from a lot of different things. The kicker motor, the main motor, other pumps that are in the boat. I think it's just a very sensitive transducer. Initially, when I bought this motor, I had some interference on that particular transducer. I didn't have it on my live sonar. I didn't have it on the 3-in-1 transducer. It was only that particular Airmar transducer. After the last update that I put on this trolling motor, the update that I put on it, I just used it from my phone, downloaded it from my phone. That took maybe 10 minutes. It said it was going to take 25 minutes. It only took about 10 minutes. After that update, I would say most, if not all, of that interference has been cleared up. Now, we'll see what happens in time, but as of right now, the last week or so since that update, I just really haven't seen much interference on my screens, if any, from that trolling motor. My overall take with this trolling motor is I couldn't be happier. Every function that I use, it includes. Some trolling motors that are out there, they may have the follow track or the stop on waypoint functions. I believe there's an app that this one can use. I've been hearing about a ProNav app that can be used to use those functions on this trolling motor, but that's something I've had in the past and never used. So I'm probably not the guy to ask about those. That's just not really my style. I believe I covered everything. If I were going to recommend a trolling motor to a person, this would definitely be at the top of my list. It's by far the best that I've used. I couldn't be happier with it. If you have any other questions on it, I don't believe I missed anything major, but feel free to comment on it and I'll do my best to get back to you as quickly as possible. Thanks for watching and good luck fishing.